Hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Just Another Kill Team podcast, connecting kill team communities across the globe. If you're passionate about the tactical skirmish game that brings together strategy, lore, and creativity, you are in the right place. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and stay updated with our latest episodes. If you want to support the show, check out our Patreon. Your support means a lot to us. Follow us by using the social media links in the podcast description for all the latest news, and be sure to leave a review to let us know what you think. Thanks for tuning in. Here's today's episode.
All right, we're back with the moisturizer himself, Taz from Australia. He's I just saw him at the World Team Championship playing Higher Tech Circle, covered in gore. But me and Jason first met him at the World Championships of Warhammer when he was playing Wormblade. And for anyone who doesn't know, his Wormblade are incredibly glossy.
Yes. Thank you very much for having me. If it's not glossy and moist, something went wrong.
Yeah. And, Australia did pretty well at the World Team Championship. I think you guys got 4th place out of 22 teams. Pretty admirable.
Yes. Yeah, very happy with that. The Australian team, which I was not part of last year, came 6th. So 4th is a step up. And notably, we had a loss. Or 2 losses and a draw, I think, off the top of my head. And basically the teams that we had a negative result into were 1, 2, and 3. So that's not too bad.
Yeah, and then you dropped this article on your personal blog, Staging and Threat Management, after the event, kind of coalescing some of the thoughts, it looks like, before, after the tournament. And that's kind of partially why we're bringing you on. With that, and
yes.
Tomb World is the new hotness, and you were just on Higher Tech Circle, so having someone who is deep in the Necron brain so that we can pick apart the staging and threat management against the new meta seems like a fun spot.
Yeah, I really like this article, and we will link this in the show notes. So if you want to check it out,
fantastic.
Go check it out at the show notes.
And staging and threat management, I think, are 2 pretty basic principles as far as when you describe it. There's tempo, there's 2-for-1s, which are pretty easy, or at least tempo is kind of hard, but 2-for-1ing is a pretty straightforward concept. Most Space Marine players kind of understand that if you get 1 model for 2 and you start with 6 and your opponent has 9, kind of up on the overall tempo of the game, because those next 5, if they also go 2-for-1, your opponent would be at -3 operatives, and you're good to go.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is basically how Jason has been playing Space Marines for the last 3 years. Yeah,
now that I've been playing some stuff that isn't Space Marines and watching it from the other side, I'm like, oh yeah, you can just run at me and there's nothing I can do about it.
And that brings us to the staging and the threat management, which I think are 2 other layers that kind of help you get to the point where your individual models can get these 2-for-1s. So Taz, you're the one that wrote the article. Why don't you tell us which team you want to kind of focus some of these thoughts on? Obviously, the article is written a little bit more generically, but I like having a couple examples so that as we walk through some of the principles, we can talk about specific examples that we run into. They might not matter by the time people listen to this, but it'll be good to have something to chew on.
Yeah, I'd say I'm most familiar with Higher Tech and Battleclade at this point. Higher Tech, I've played a stupidly large number of games in the lead up to WTC. And Battleclade are my new love moving into the post-classification world where Wormblade are no longer around. So I'd say probably from their perspective is where I would sit for examples, for sure.
Yeah, and Battleclade and Higher Tech Circle, both teams that can get a lot of use out of staging threats and knowing which ones of your dorks to go send in to die. And I guess, Canoptech Circle also get to do that because they got fully disposable warriors floating around that can die and then as a strategic gambit come back on following turns.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, bait, as Jason would like to say, to kick the hornet's nest, because Jason has been on Vespid as of late.
Especially with the Hornet's Nest vibes, yeah. Vespid are pretty fun, but they are a very casino-y team. But yeah, I mean, someone's got to kick the Hornet's Nest.
Yeah, and the Vespid are more, they get to play pure staging, and then their threat management is really your opponent's threat management, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's like you want to set up a bunch of non-reciprocal threats, which is one of the big concepts in this article. And then it's just like when you get there, You just hope to roll 4-ups. But you can shoot first a lot, which is important.
Yeah, you can
Yeah,
take it on both ends.
I think on the kicking the hornet's nest, Higher-Tech and Battleclade both sort of shine and do well in my experience when you do that, because they can both capitalize if your opponent doesn't react to the way that you started off. They can both capitalize on that by essentially reutilizing the piece that's already been used, which is a kind of cheeky way to get that going.
And this is because they both have ways to reuse expended operatives. Battleclade can do network counteracts, where later operatives can force someone who's already gone to go again and do a single shoot action or melee action, depending on what's going on. And then the Higher-Tech Circle and Canoptic Circle can both have their Cryptex or Prentex laser beam someone again, or even just shoot through someone who's already gone, right? In the case of Higher-Tech
100%. Yep, exactly. And even in the situation where you might, for Higher-Tech specifically, you might kick something off by doing a late Turning Point 1 strike. The threat of what that operative can do Turning Point 2 is not just that operative. It's what the Prentech and Cryptech can do through that operative as well, which adds an extra layer of importance of deal with this or things are going to go wrong. But from the article's perspective, I kind of start out by just like describing what is important, and we've sort of already covered that. It's sort of what threats you have, what threats your opponents have. In the case of the Vespid, how do you deal with all of these flying operatives? And then the other one, which I link with threat management and staging, is how you and your opponent both score, which kind of links back to something that I think has come up a couple of times recently on the podcast, where people have identified trading models for position or for scoring advantage early, and having your opponent have to deal with that. So knowing what can be used to score on each side and how to either capitalize on that or deny it is another sort of big concept that I talk about.
There's like a scoring tempo on each turn. How many points you expect on each crit up, how many you expect on each tack up, and then kill up is by the end of the game, and that's kind of your kill count over the turns. And there's a couple teams that break that tempo really, really hardcore. You know, Kroot and Ratlings both are teams that can score inside of opposing control range, and the new Deathwatch can also do it with their little cute servo skull.
Yes. Yeah. So those definitely shake up how you can defend against it. And the other big one that's kind of shaken up things a bit in my eyes with the new approved ops, not that I've played that many games with it, is some of the crit ops have a way smaller range of points. So there'll just be 6 available to split, which is definitely a lot more scarce.
Yeah,
and there's also tack ops that you don't have to score Turning Point 2, which is another big one.
Yeah, it definitely feels like this current approved ops deck is trying to force the scores down a little bit to make ties maybe a little bit more difficult, because now instead of having the full 12 points available over the 3 turning points where you can score, you're going to end up with, like 4 or 5 in total, and it's going to be harder to tie. And that's it looks like that's kind of the goal. We'll see how it plays out, because obviously players optimize as games go on, and this new tack op deck and new crit op deck will give both Kroot and Ratlings new opportunities to seal the spotlight, although we also now have 2 teams that can just score while not on objectives, Battleclade being one of them, and then the new Canoptic Circle score with their obelisk markers. So those are another couple teams that change kind of the operative and the board position required to be able to score, and that's also something you have to keep in mind when you're thinking about what counts as a threat through the turn, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a game against as Battleclade into Canoptic Circle, playing the new State Claim mission, and by just leaving one of his markers, the obelisk markers, on one of the points, he was able to make a claim about that he would control it. And I had to go and interact with that objective that I had no other reason to interact with. And yeah, that felt like a very, very powerful thing to be able to do from his end, to double up on that obelisk
Yeah, you
resource like that.
basically are always fighting over two stakes against the Canoptic Circle, because the Canoptic Circle can say this back objective is going to be controlled by me, as their 8 operatives run around in the midboard.
Yeah, exactly. One of the other things that I like to think about with threat concepts is area denial. This is very much in my mind coming from the higher tech circle play patterns, where you have the combination of nanomine and the deathmark conceal guard as a way to shut down huge areas of the board, especially potent on the old Volker's map 2. I was able to stop people getting to their home objective without being shot, unless they were very careful with a heavy barricade placement, which is pretty gross. So I find area denial is a massive thing that newer players kind of don't appreciate too much, and part of what I was trying to convey with this article, which initially I started to develop as a resource for some of the local community, because we had a large influx of new players with the new edition, and they were sort of starting to get to quite a good competitive standard, but sometimes would miss some of the fundamentals. Was to highlight that stopping your opponent from doing what they want to do is a very powerful thing.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why Phobos was so good for so long in this last map pack, because they had both plant beacons, which meant that they could score their tac ops pretty safely because they had a couple extra APL, and sometimes they were free. And they also had Omni Scramble, which meant that standing near this Vox Breaker would just be miserable, because you would just get sniped from across the edge of the board by some operative that has no business interacting with you. But depending on how you line it up, you can definitely do that. So having stuff that explicitly calls out an area, higher tech circles gets the slow bubble that is at the moment, an 8-inch bubble, which is a lot. Rekka Crew get it by launching a pulsar rocket into your opposing drop zone, which I don't think it really gets a ton of use, but definitely can do some stuff against horde teams, just because if you can affect more operatives, you can imagine it as taxing your opponent more and more over the course of the game.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Phobos does a great job with it. It's the same exact thing as Higher Tech Circle, where the Phobos marksman can go on guard. Deathwatch does that too, but Deathwatch specifically on Gallowdark, if you perform a shoot action, you can immediately go back on guard, which is insane. Like, that really, really shuts down a room if you set it up right. That's huge. Jaegers do that as well with the landmines. You just put those landmines all over the board at the start of the game as area denial to kind of mess people up and funnel people into places and stuff like that. So there's a lot of teams out there and a lot of tools, and it's definitely some stuff that you should be putting some thought into if you've got a team that does that, and keep an eye out for teams that can do that against you.
Yeah, Hurricane Jaeger are a really good call out, because not only do you have the mines that are explicitly, 20 millimeter circles with 1-inch bubbles that you don't want to walk over, but they also have the bombast sitting behind stuff ready to flip over at the beginning of the next turn to shoot someone, and that guy is generally covering 2 operatives that are farther forward, because they can also shoot into combat when you charge them. So you can imagine Hurricane Jaeger as kind of having a bishop floating behind every operative ready to cap you when you go charge them. So there's also countercharge threats, which can kind of deny things depending on what type of opponents you're fighting against. Because when you're fighting against a melee operative, that shooting attack from the backfield getting into the midline is going to be way more powerful, right? Whereas against a shooting team, the shooter team will just run around and just shoot you. Yeah. And I guess, Taz, you were coming from Wormblade, and obviously one of the oldest area denial pieces that's going away with classification is going to be the Wormblade Locust, who would just turn on a bubble, and if you walked within his range, he would just jump out and murder you.
Yes. So much fun. And combined with the one-way mines that they gained in this edition, that was probably near when I first started taking non-reciprocal staging very seriously, as a tool that I always try to bring to every game when I can. And I guess it's kind of informed my team selection a little bit as a result.
Yeah, and so just to clarify what non-reciprocal threats are for anyone who's not in the know, it's basically any threat that you can do that your opponent can't interact with unless they have an extra APL or some other way to interact with it, Probably the easiest example would be almost any elf team against any human team, where the elves have an extra inch of movement, so they always charge farther than you can charge. They can always move and shoot you farther than you can move and shoot them. So you got to have the APL to break that somehow. And relatively often, elf teams generally have a dash baked in, so you can imagine each elf as having a 7-inch move with a 3-inch dash and then a 2-inch shooting range, or the full 10-inch melee range of 9 inches of movement plus the 1 inch of threat range for control
Yeah,
range.
absolutely.
And those
other
tend
things
to be rough to interact with. So when you're thinking about how to fight those teams, how do you break those non-reciprocal threats?
So that's where the first thing to look at for me with teams, as you pointed out, is the move stat, but then also abilities. One that comes to mind for Brood Brothers is it's pervasive is the dash, and then there's the other one which lets them
Insidious is the
climb.
dash,
No,
and pervasive
Insidious is the dash, pervasive is the yep. So things like that. So they've got an out of activation move. Well, they've got both, right? So they've got a thing that reduces the amount of movement that they have to spend dealing with terrain, and then they've also got a thing which lets them move out of activations. So getting out of activation movement or ignoring some penalty that the other team has to pay is a big one for evening up those kind of raw stat discrepancies. Another one that I started taking more seriously after playing against Bart at World Championship of Warhammer last year was the power of having small bases and using equipment terrain to make one-way move paths. So he was playing Void Dancers at the time and was able to basically make a whole bunch of 25 mil gaps where the small bases would go through. And my agents, while I was playing Whiteblade, would have to deal with those pieces of equipment terrain that he'd placed.
Yeah, climb over it.
Yeah, and then I think another one that I might have actually picked up from you, Jason, was the power of staging melee operatives on vantages, where to get up onto the vantage, the opposition needs to pay the full climb tax, but the drop tax is always going to be at 2 inches less or more if you've got some other ability in play. So you can project a threat range that is longer, or make up that move differential between a 6-inch move and a 7-inch move model by just being above them. Yeah, and obviously that's something that you only ever really get to do if the opponent doesn't have a way to deal with the model on advantage, like Seek Light or something similar. But another nice one to have in the back pocket for sure. So I think those are kind of the points that I look at to deal with that sort of imbalance in threat that my opponent can project. My favorite being out of activation movement, personally.
Out of activation movement is amazing.
Yeah, we've got that on Ratlings, on Mandrakes, on Brood Brothers, kind of on Inquisition Agents sometimes, in the sense that your opponent can run away from you and you get to dash after them, which can really mess people up if they're not paying attention.
Yeah. There's a few teams with strat phase movement. Wormblade, Higher-Tech, and Battleclade all have an option for strat phase movement.
Movement outside of activation is always very good because it extends your threat range. And also, that's what people are looking for. You're trying to hit first and not get hit before your opponents. And that's where staging comes into play most of the time, right? Because we're talking about staging these melee threats on top of Vantage, but you can also stage a shooting threat, with an APL further out than your opponent can interact with. And, to ground it out in a fun example, Battleclade can have some crazy threat ranges just because you can move, you can dash through a wall that you've breached, and then you can have someone else network counteract you even farther afield and then get that 2 inches and blow someone up. So fully safely against the Vulcus wall, you've got your 5 inches, your extra dash, and then your other dash from your Underseer telling you to go another 3 inches forward, and then you get your 2-inch range on your gun. And suddenly your Melter has an 11-inch range when it's out activating your opponent. Your opponent's like, oh no, I'm not ready for this.
Pretty confident that Battleclade have the longest alpha strike in the game at the moment. This is just I've only compared them to Corsairs, and they've got a longer threat range than Corsairs now. With the covert disguises for 3 inches, and then a reposition dash gets them a 5-inch move and a 3-inch, and then the Underseer dash 3. So that's a total of 14 inches of movement. and then they can shoot, and they can do all of the movement and conceal, and then flip for the shoot, which I think is potentially the longest that is possible. I'm not 100% certain.
I think so too.
I haven't gone through it all,
especially
but
like if you do it with your leader guy who actually doesn't really have another purpose. I mean, he's just fast and he's pretty shooty, and he's kind of tanky. You can look down, get down, Mr. President for him, all that kind of stuff. You can ignore piercing, but really, like, he's a pretty good cruise missile.
yeah, absolutely. On maps where handing out ceaseless for the first half of the game is possible, that's an amazing role, and then later in the game can start to do the 6-inch move to a marker in the strat phase, and then reposition dash another 9 to then shoot somebody that wasn't expecting to be shot. Super flexible piece. And then with what you were saying, Travis, about the breacher, that provides, like, those breach hole in wall abilities provide so much area denial because of that non-reciprocal staging. If you can get behind a wall of Volca's Ruin or a stronghold that's overlooking the center point in a way that your opponent can't get to you, but you can comfortably, without any other setup, cover anyone that moves onto that point, you're in an incredibly powerful position.
Yeah, and I think if we're focusing in on Battleclade, specifically on Tomb World, because of the new breach points, there's also some extra funny business that the breacher can do on these boards, because turns out one of the cheeky things is that you can have someone breach a hole in a wall and then reveal a disguise and not have it be the original breacher.
Yeah, because it's not an ability on the card.
It's not technically an ability on the card, so that you could do some cheeky. And this is one of those things where it's both staging and a threat that your opponent has to think about, because Tomb World, as much as it is very much in the dark but a little bit different, that 2 APL tax and the different way that you have to move through the breach points actually ends up mattering quite a bit as far as what sorts of threats are actually legal at any given time. So Battleclade having this whole extra pocket of, these 2 doors on my side actually don't matter because I can blow them both up immediately, it actually can be a big part of staging a proper threat, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that, I can't actually remember what it's called, the one that lets you switch the position of the operatives, has some other kind of cheeky interactions where, as far as I'm aware, if an operative takes damage or gets stunned or gets an effect applied to them and you use it, you then move the operative that's been damaged. Like, it doesn't stay with, so if your flamer runs up and is just out in the open and gets shot with a gun that does 4 damage and stuns, and then you flip it with the melter isn't the one that's 4 damage and stun, that's the flamer, which is now safe. True. So you can use, if you're confident in what your opponent can throw at you, turning point 1, you can use it to bait that engagement early and then hide the piece that was exposed and potentially stunned or damaged.
Yeah, and Battleclade are definitely one of the teams that I feel like you have to get your opponent to kind of take some bait somewhere, because as much as you can send your Melt-A-Gun really far afield, if he's on your opponent's half of the board, and everyone can stay hidden and kill that one Melta after he kills the one guy, they might just do that, and then you're still stuck with these 5-inch movement operatives. So how are you staging your threats with Battleclade to try to get your opponent to interact with you and play the game that Battleclade wants you to play? Because Battleclade are really good if your opponent is on engage and visible to the rest of your team, right? But not so good if everyone is on conceal and hiding from you.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is a concept that both Battleclade and Higher-Tech really try to make use of, which is if a game devolves into like a shooting match or like a brawl, then they're in a good position because they have so much that can come to bear if they have the opportunity to. So as part of that, I, for example, with Higher-Tech would almost always take Scout reposition and then almost always spend a CP turning point 1 for command underlings. So I'd end up with an immortal 6 inches up the board, which I would then APL buff, probably, unless my opponent absolutely respected that threat. And if they respected my threat, then I would be gaining a huge amount of area in terms of it actually being denied turning point 1. So I would typically, you do that similar thing with Battleclade, except obviously scouting is gone. Rest in peace, scouting. But
All hail initiative rerolls.
I generally try to have some aggressive staging turning point one, and this might just come back to me playing as a slightly more aggressive player. I try to have some staging turning point one, which in the worst case, if my opponent respects it, is just going to give me the area denial that helps me. It stops them staging in an aggressive spot for them. And in the best case, they'll accept that I'm going to get a shot, and I will then be able to move up and initiate that brawl, I guess, or shootout, while simultaneously aggressively staging other models. They just won't be as far forward because they didn't get that initial strat movement. So that's, I guess, kind of like my approach to turning point one. The big one with that is doing something that aggressive can fall over if the threats aren't independent, which is in the sense that if they're right next to each other, a Space Marine winning initiative is just going to charge one, kill it, and shoot the other. So they need to be staged in a way that they can't all just fall over.
Or, like a Blades of Cain Howling Banshee with 3 APL is going to get that one kill and then swing out and shoot the other one, right? So you got to be careful that your threats that are far field are not close together and far field trying to hit the same lane. Like spreading out your threats probably is going to get a little bit of extra value here,
Yes, exactly. And another, like a similar one is not just the positioning independence, but also do they both need the same resource to do it? So I guess as just an example that just popped into my head after you mentioned Blades of Cain would be in a mixed Blades of Cain team, are you staging two threats that both want to use the same ability? And then if you use it on one, the other one's not going to work. And then you've just staged one thing. Which can be all right if it if you only actually need one threat to go off.
Right? Like Blades of Cain are the perfect example of like you can have two guys getting ready to use fly, and then the first one dies, and then the second one I guess is going to use fly now, or the first one is then becomes the I'm going to go first and parry in combat and try to survive, and because they really only have 8 operatives. So as much as you can stage aggressively, you also have to be careful about staging too aggressively and getting blown out by a single opponent coming over and squishing you. Or, a single goremonger aspiranting through 3 guys, and then the game is over.
Yes, exactly. So, yeah, I typically like to stage aggressively turning point one. It might not be the most optimal. Well, it's almost certainly not the most optimal in every scenario, but the teams that I play generally like to brawl. And in this, not necessarily in like melee combat, but just like to have a messy game and like to take advantage of my opponent.
Some version of raw power or like some version of you get to break the game in a very specific way that incentivizes you to have a little bit messier of a game.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
But Higher Tech Circle and Battle Clade are both good examples because Higher Tech Circle, get back up. If your opponent commits too many resources to a kill, you've got a couple turns to pick them back up. And if you position your kill marker correctly, it can still contribute to the board, which is really annoying for most people. Yes. And then Battle Clade, a single 1 wound servitor can still do quite a bit of work. It can both network counteract for other people and be network counteracted too and continue shooting.
Yeah, absolutely. And in both of those situations, you're often dictating the tempo that your opponent needs to play at to minimize the incoming risk, because all of a sudden they have to deal with your expended operative.
And I think this is probably a good time for us to push on to, how different sized teams have to manage both their staging and kind of like the threat that they can project. Because we're talking right now about teams that, on Battle Clade, you got 10 operatives. On Higher Tech Circle, you get 8, but you can kind of expect it to be 10-ish, depending on how many resurrects you get. If one guy dies each turn, you've got 3 chances to res, plus another 3 from your res bot, but I doubt he generally gets more than 1 or 2 off over the course of the game. So you can imagine Higher Tech Circle is maybe 11 or 12 operatives throughout the course of a game.
Yep.
And then we can compare that to the other hotness in the metagame right now, which is Elves. I don't know if Elves will continue being good in the new Approved Ops 2025, but Elves and the current power in September of Kill Team 2025 elves have become the kind of like the meta staple of they can punch down on the Marines by being slightly more efficient than them, and then they can punch up against the hordes because the hordes have lots of guys, and each one of your dudes can probably get a 2-for-1, right? So there are different kinds of threats that you have to stage on these different size teams, and hordes are kind of in a weird spot outside of maybe Brood Brothers right now.
You guys, I'm jumping in with a quick advertisement. If you are listening to this and you're planning to go to the New York Open and you haven't bought your tickets already, do it now. Log in right now. We've got a link in the description of the show notes, and get your tickets to the New York Open, and we'll see you there. Same thing for the Renegade Open. New York Open is coming up October 18th weekend, and November 22nd is the weekend of Renegade Open in Minnesota. Grab your tickets. See you there.
Yeah. So I kind of like on a very high level think of the different approaches to staging as essentially you could aim to deny all of your opponent's threats so that you're at zero risk should they win initiative. You could aim to partially do that and have select things that you either don't care about or are confident that they will survive within the threat of your opponent. Or you can stage in such a way that you can make one of your threats extend their threat range later in the turn. This is the classic horde approach from last edition, where you set up everything on one melter gunner or similar to then run out at the end of the turn and do some damage. Or then there's the one which I use Jason's term of feeding the bite, which is basically just the threat saturation. So for the different sized teams, some of those will all end in different playstyles in the way that they score. One of those 4 usually fits better. So for example, I had a brief stint with a melee Deathwatch team, and I found that threat saturation felt fantastic. Just all 5 Marines running forward was enough of a problem for my opponent that I usually ended up on top. Whereas
I've messed around with that a little bit, so I can confirm that having the one dude sitting on your home objective probably doesn't do all that much when you're playing a more melee skewed Deathwatch. So just getting in, giving up that one backline point, and pushing out to make sure you just blitz your opponent. Because 5 Deathwatch Marines are going to be much harder for people to interact with than 4 Deathwatch Marines.
Yeah, exactly. And like 20% of your team that you have to leave behind, which is a lot.
I think both Raveners and Deathwatch both have to watch where their operatives are positioned. Raveners get the benefit of being able to basically have a superposition as long as they're inside the tunnel. So you've got 5 operatives, but you basically are always across this long part of the board by the time you're at the end of the game. But Deathwatch are wherever they are. So leaving a guy at the backfield, you better have a good reason for it.
Yes. And conversely, playing into those teams, I have found the idea of a partial target denial to work quite well, in the sense that I try to stage such that a Marine can't move double shoot, or ideally a melee Marine or elf or similar can't charge and fight and then do something else. But
sometimes that can mean on these wider teams that you're just not moving, right?
Yeah. But usually I'm okay with the idea of a 3 APL model on a smaller team move dash shooting, because if they're move dash shooting into one of my shotgun guys on Wormblade, or maybe
one
it's
of
like
your flamers on Battleclade.
Yeah.
Your poor little Akellanai who's granting Seek Light and Obscurity. Maybe he's the one that gets sent out as bait, because he's not going to do much against the 5 Marines.
Exactly.
Melt the gun is your baby boy. He's trying to be kept safe as long as possible.
Yep, exactly that. So in that situation, if they're having to move dash shoot, and then I can counterpunch and kill that piece, I've effectively invited them to do a 1-for-1 trade, which is advantageous for me. Or if they don't take that, they're then having to waste that activation, and I then have a forward piece which could be used for something else.
Yeah. When it comes to the different team size and the way that they behave in the games, one thing that I've kind of noticed as like a general trend, and I think we've touched on this a little bit in a previous episode, but the concept of the team with a smaller model count generally has to be the team that pushes the tempo. Because if you both are just being kind of cautious, then the last activations can run up on you and hit you without you being able to answer if you're careful and you do it right. So to avoid people doing that to you a bunch, you need to be the one instigating. And then also in the name of threat saturation, if you're fighting against a team that only has 2 APL, like let's say you're fighting against like Mandrakes or Vespid, that's 2 of the teams I'm looking at a lot. Space Marines can just run in there, and if you just have this like domino field of doesn't matter who goes first or second, Space Marines have the potential of killing 2 Mandrakes, and Mandrakes do not have the potential of killing 1 Space Marine, and their odds of even killing 1 are not great. And then you just like catapult in there. You are basically just doing twice as much damage in that turning point as they do back to you, and there's nothing they can do about it. So even if you take a hit or 2 on the way in, but you're staged to the point where they don't have the APL to do as much damage as you do, you're gonna crush them.
Yeah, and I think part of, in my mind, what the next step of deciding how you're going to stage a team into a team like that is recognizing that there's a reasonable chance that they are just going to stage hyper aggressively. And in doing so, you kind of need to prepare for that, which often means playing more of like a kind of cat and mouse sort of game where you're doing hit and run around the edges. For example, with Mandrakes, trying to pick off a lone target with a Dirge Maw, or getting stun grenades involved to increase the odds of killing something. Yeah, and I think that's the point that you made about the smaller teams dictating the tempo into the larger teams is quite interesting, because reflecting on how it feels to dictate the tempo with Higher-Tech and Battleclade, which are sort of the mid-range teams, into an elite team, does feel like I'm kind of taking the opposite role to what they're expecting.
Yeah.
And this is because when you're playing the slightly larger teams in the Astartes, if you go in first, your opponent is then forced to interact with you or respond to the threat. And if you've already killed a Marine, suddenly now, they're going to go in, kill the thing that's already gone, and then you get all of the tempo advantage of just nailing something that's killed like a dork.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Operative. And then also, I mean, just like pushing the tempo does kind of work all the time. Because if you go out there, let's say I'm playing Blooded against Deathwatch, and I go out there and I throw a crack grenade at a Space Marine, and then on the other side of the field, where no one Space Marine can activate to inflict violence on both of these guys, the other one runs over on the other side, throws a crack grenade also because they group activate. Now I've move blocked you in 2 different places, and you have to spend a whole activation to open that lane potentially, and anyone that does that is going to be counterpunched by whoever else is staged nearby. So you can dictate the tempo even with a horde team. It's just especially important to do so with an elite team, in my opinion.
And some of the threats that you can do with an elite team is making sure that your overwatches are really important. And, Deathwatch obviously are the new addition to the game as of right now. And the double counteract is also a really big part. The same thing on Raveners, on why Raveners can be so ridiculously effective, is that having the ability to counteract, take 2 actions, means that you're never really out of the activation game, even when you're getting out activated. And that's part of the reason why these 5-man elite teams have so much power, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The double counteract is so spicy, and I think it kind of ties into the idea of ending an activation in a spot which will be useful. So even if it's like the micro adjustment of you throw out a threat, you run up with the melter to do something, or maybe not the best example because the amount of times the melter has a counteract is low unless you're playing Battleclad. But
their counteract happens immediately afterwards.
That counteract happens immediately. On the like a Deathwatch operative, which charges, fights, and shoots, where you end that charge so that you can use the 2 APL counteract to the most effect is kind of an extra level of thought, and like the opposite end of that, trying to position in a way where an enemy's counteract or follow-up move from after they've dealt with your piece isn't going to be as useful is
and if we're looking at some of the wider teams, I think a good example of this is when you know your opponent's going to get these counteracts, you can imagine every opposing operative is having an extra 2 inches of movement. For example, if you're playing Kroot, God forbid, against Deathwatch right now, you've got 12 operatives to their 5. They're guaranteed 5 counteracts unless you've sacked all of your pieces to them, which probably is not the best idea. So you can imagine whatever their final positions are, you can add an extra 2 inches. So when you're measuring out your opponent's threat range, you can go the full 8 plus the 1, which is 9, and you always just tack on the 11. And if you end up 11 inches past whatever their frontline movement is, you can just not get hit.
Yes, absolutely.
And this is actually something that I do when I play against things like Tempestus Aquilons, or in the past when Void Dancer Troop ignored terrain entirely. You could just draw out the maximum distance they could be at turning point 1 and just never move past that line, and you just know that you're not likely to get hit. And Tempestus Aquilons, same thing. You know that they start on the edge of their board, which is 3 or 6 inches, depending on the board, or whatever the measurement is on In the Dark, which I honestly can't remember the perfect measurement for. But then you can add on the 4 inches of movement, and then the other 4 inches of movement, and then the 1 inch off of the drop marker, and then the 3 inches. So it's like a 17-inch range. And if you never move past there, they can never shoot you.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me of, I had this kind of wake up moment in a game against Azwemblade against Blooded in 2nd edition, playing against Sam, and he'd set up his diabolic bomb in a spot which covered a decent amount of the map, and I respected it, but I didn't respect the threat that he would have next turn if he just, instead of using that threat, just moved it all the way as far as he possibly could forwards. And as a result, copped a nasty bomb. And that kind of like added to that post-threat scenario analysis for me, where it's like the threat has a threat range this turn, but if you're on a team like a Horde team, which has more activations, that threat, you can then stage, instead of using it, you've already done the area denial, you then aggressively stage it again. And if you win initiative, it does tremendous amounts of work. And yeah, I think drawing from that, it's kind of like into these hyper elite teams with 5 operatives, you're suddenly having to do that with the counteracts way earlier in the turning point than you expect.
Yeah, and it is
I
kind of
think
crazy.
at the end of
if someone is like activated out on one side when you're playing against, like, if you're playing Deathwatch and you just like your 5th activation, you full send run and you get like 4 inches away from a threat, and they can't hit you on their next activation, and then you counteract and you move 2 more inches and shoot the thing that's in that target. That's already something that I've seen come up a couple times playing against Deathwatch, and that's craziness. I mean, they really can just rip and zip out there, and that extra 2 inches is huge, and that's like one of the things that you should also be thinking about. Like, you can take 2 extra inches on your counteract. Kind of similar, we sort of touched on similar concepts, but Goremongers, you want to end the turn being within 3 inches of an enemy, so that in your next strategy phase, you can charge things, which is, just like some more of that out of activation movement that can really like catch people out, and is kind of like the biggest thing to watch out for. And then I also want to shout out my favorite new trick that haven't tried yet because I haven't played the team yet, but Mandrakes, with the out of activation dash followed by doing a 9-inch charge that ignores all terrain. There's like no movement in the game that is that rude. That's just like a 12-inch charge that ignores all terrain. You just like can't hide from that at all.
Yeah, there's a lot of asymmetric threats in the game, and sometimes the asymmetric threats are actually based around turn order as well, because they're, in the past, we've had stuff like the Hearthkin Salvagers who were guaranteed to basically take the last activation against Marine and guaranteed to take the first activation against Marine. It still kind of exists to some extent, but not nearly as strong. But there are other teams, like the Goremongers in this situation, who, because they have a strat phase charge, you can kind of guarantee that even if you lose initiative, you still get one action that you want out of the trade.
Yeah.
So that's another thing when you're staging threats and thinking about your turn 1, turn 2 board positioning, is how many of these rules can you really make use of? And that's something that I think the more recent teams of Kill Team play into, whereas like the older teams a little bit less so, because those things weren't nearly as present or prevalent when the game was being developed. And now, after 4 years of development, there's a lot more initiative fudging, and there's a lot more out of phase or out of turn activations and actions now.
Yeah, well, especially with the change to the way that initiative works, the gambits that people will be able to make in terms of the actual play being a gambit, knowing that they have a +3 initiative card or reroll initiative in their pocket, is pretty wild.
Also hopping in again to let you know that Crossfire Games is super sick. The battle box is amazing, and you can order one using the link in the show notes.
Yeah, I mean, the Hearthstone Salvagers have gotten a taste for the last couple of years. I know there's a player in the Midwest who's been rampaging around with them in the past. I don't know if he's still playing them. He might be on Brood Brothers or something else right now. But knowing that you're very likely to take initiative does just let you create more opportunities on later turns. And I think this is a good spot for us to talk about, pushing those threats and having redundancy in those threats, which is something you talk about at the end of your article. And especially on teams like Brood Brothers, where you have lots of threats that are kind of about the same size. You got 2 gunners, one of them is probably a little more dangerous than the other. And then you've got a couple melee threats that are all kind of about the same size. And you've got the Magus generally in the background who can mind bullet people. Those are all things at different sizes, so having some redundancy so you know who you can easily risk is definitely an important part of the game. And Jason sounds like he's been playing full redundancy for the last couple months, and he's about to pick up Mandrakes, which are also another team of full redundancy. So you guys want to talk about how you stage redundant threats, or what sorts of threats you're willing to give up as a risk when you're staging?
Yeah, I like to think about redundancy on an even more granular level at times. Goremongers being an example, with the Inciter who can potentially take down a Marine. I'm not so sure about the Deathwatch Marines, but definitely one of the older ones. And that was because, it has redundancy because at each step in the sequence of events, you can change whether you continue, decide whether you continue and you're not really expending any resources to do so. So the sequence was like you shoot, do some chip damage, and you see how much chip damage you do, and then you can suck up the bleeding token, and then you can charge and use the rake to do D3. And then depending on what breakpoint that gets to, you can choose to suck up the bleeding token again, and then you can gain an APL and fight. So at each point there's like if the shoot does enough that the rake is going to be meaningful, you can rake. And then if the rake does enough that the fight's going to be meaningful, you can fight. And the whole way through there, the kind of like redundant out, I guess, is that you can just stop and leave a bleeding token on the enemy. And that's also a useful outcome. You've done chip and you've left a bleeding token. So where possible, I like to kind of think about action sequencing in that sense with redundancy. And the threats that have that sort of level of redundancy are usually the ones that I'll push up first if I can, because I don't want to start a sequence in a turning point with something that could go catastrophically wrong and result in me losing many points or a key piece. Whereas I would prefer to start with a piece that has some inbuilt redundancy in itself, and then have the backup of my important piece doing the work after the fact. And obviously trying to, as I mentioned before, stage those threats independently so that they both don't fall over to the one thing as well.
I guess it's part of why Higher Tech Circle is such a powerful team for people to pick up, right? Because you're always redundant, and because your Apprentech and your leader can always shoot through people who've already gone, those big power pieces are never really done at any given time. And part of the reason why Battleclade is so powerful, because none of your threats are really ever activated.
Yes, yeah, exactly that. And like the nice redundancy that's just built in with Higher Tech is that because you have the 4 sort of warrior type pieces being the Despotek and the Immortals, any of the or Deathmarks as well, any of them can fill the role of being the piece that gets picked up with Time Splinter and put down. So they can all do something, and if the thing that they do is effective and suddenly they're free, you can pick them and pull them back. Or if they somehow survive something that they shouldn't have, you can pull them back. And there's a lot of kind of built-in redundancy in a way that just optimizes how your operatives are spent. So you can really game the material advantage by putting people in better positions with Time Splinter specifically. Which is just a ridiculously strong ability.
And I guess to lens it into something new on Tomb World, because Canoptech Circle kind of do this, but they do it in a very different way in that their obelisk node matrix can have both their medic and their +1 APL buffer sitting safely behind a box that no one can interact with because it's 12 inches away from you, and your whole team is both getting +1 APL from the node matrix and the ability to res as long as it's a shooting attack.
Yeah. Another thing that I ran into playing against Canoptic Circle, and this is something that I'm going to have to consider whenever I play against them in the future, is that if the matrix is far enough up the board at a spot where a macrosite can respawn in the drop and just gun 10 inches straight forwards and end in the matrix, it's able to reposition dash 10 inches forwards and then shoot because it gains an APL. So that being like it's not really spawning in the drop, it's kind of spawning on the midfield and shooting from that spot. Kind of gives them like this sort of turret-like effect that I hadn't considered before. I'd sort of had the initial thought of the ones that come back are just going to be my home objective mission monkeys, or I'm going to expect my opponent to do that. But the ability that they have to just regenerate and throw that operative back to exactly where it was and shoot again is wild.
Some gnarly stuff. I guess in terms of talking about how you use these principles of staging threats and threat management, when we look at the new approved ops deck, are there any things that you think about when you're looking at the new TAC ops spread that you feel like these concepts are useful for thinking about the new TAC ops? Like, for example, when we read mark enemy movements, I immediately thought of, any wide team with recon can now suddenly force their opponent elite team on Volcus because, on Tomb World and in the Dark, this is not going to get any use on turn one. But just the ability for someone on advantage in your drop zone to spot an opponent and have that elite now have to run away from your enemy movement as the first activation of a turn, actually pretty powerful. And, that's one of those things where I'm imagining a really obvious early play that has outsized impact over the rest of the game, because each of your early operatives as a recon horde team can now make any number of elites that have kept the toe out of line now suddenly have to play the rest of the turn, either ending fully out of visibility or just, not doing anything for the turn.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a zoning threat, right? But it's you're threatening to score if they let that model see the model that's been marked. I guess it's that model. But generally anyone, like if you're out activating, you can do the action and then they have to respect that model that's just sitting on top, hopefully doing something passive that's not costing them anything to do. In terms of the sort of using the threat and staging concepts, flank sort of appealed to me from a higher tech perspective because you're able to use these tools which can claim so much space and really punish opponents for moving into that space and push up one side of the board. I feel like that would be quite a intuitive thing to do as a higher tech player. And similarly, I think that Martyrs kind of has some sort of funny interactions like that, particularly for that team because the reanimation markers can control a Martyr token or contest it. But it's sort of like you're centraling, and I guess this is kind of true for all of the security TAC ops. You're providing a point of bait, which you can set up a plan around and expect your opponent to come and interact with that point.
Yeah, security is definitely one of the TAC op spreads that me and Jason both marked as whatever you do, your opponent is going to have time to try to interact with you. Martyrs on Higher Tech Circle maybe being one of the notable examples where a backline operative that has been killed on an objective because it was just standing there unengaged actually scores you a point, and that can be very upsetting. But that's not how most people play the game.
Yeah. In terms of ones that I liked, and again, I have no idea how well this will actually work, but the notion of plant devices really stuck out to me in the same kind of like it, in theory, denies or makes your opponent have to consider the cost of interacting with the objectives that you've planted devices on. The big one that sort of limits it, obviously, is trying to get it on your opponent's objective, which, again, Crit Rattling's eating good with that. But yeah, I think it'll be very interesting to see how people explore the new tech ops in that sort of mindset of how can I not only score from this, but score in a way that makes my opponent be in an uncomfortable position.
Yeah, and I guess one of the fun ways that me and Jason were thinking about implant device, which is one of the new infiltration tech ops, which wants you to do a new mission action on each of the objective markers. We're thinking about Ravener specifically, where as long as you run your tunnel directly over to your opponent's objective, you can imagine the game as guaranteed to have one on your opponent's, one on yours, and one on the middle, because you're always going to be fighting over the middle. And you know that at any point you can burrow in the tunnel and then come up on a strat phase if your opponent's not paying attention and drop the device. So if your opponent's not paying attention, you can imagine the whole game as that's locked away in the bag. And that's one of those threats that you can keep in the back pocket. Never say, and the moment your opponent lets their guard down, you can spring a 2-point gap.
Yeah. Another one that I like the look of, and this is probably the moist Wormblade player in me, but I've always enjoyed any team that has an order flip mechanic. And part of that is because you can make an operative that's already done something into a scoring threat with a tack up like track enemy. So, for example, on Wormblade, I'm imagining a goon moves up and throws a crack grenade at something, and hopefully it dies, or maybe it doesn't. But then if it flips back to conceal and has visibility on other things, suddenly that operative is a scoring threat, even though it's materially not worth much, or potentially also like strategically not worth much in the sense that it might be well out of position of anything relevant, and you're kind of forcing your opponent to have to interact with that. I guess it's kind of like sort of inverse to the recon scout enemy movement, where that is trying to make your opponents have to hide, whereas this is if your opponent doesn't kill the thing that is of little value to me because I've already gotten value out of it, I'm going to score. Which, yeah, is appealing to me, probably because of that Wormblade origin with the old, I can't actually remember, Stalk Target, I think was one of them from second edition.
Way back in the day.
Yeah,
I mean, nowadays I'm looking at this new tac op deck and just imagining, old monsters of the past that haven't been very good right now. Felgor Ravagers being one of the ones that, ate a bunch of nerfs, but hasn't really been prevalent in the metagame for quite a bit as far as overall play rate and stats. Now they've got access to route again, which is a perfect combo for them because they always want to run up and hit you anyways. So having that back on the menu now creates a zone where you want to get your operatives out of, but you worry about giving your opponents more spot to fight, because route is anyone within 6 inches of opposing drop zone scores you points when they get a kill.
Yeah. It's kind of like route and flank are interesting because they encourage your opponent to move forward, which for some teams is not something that they want to be doing.
Yeah, anywhere where you can force your opponent's movement into the jaws of your trap is generally a good thing. And it's one of those spots where the old shooting teams, like the old Horde shooting teams that used to rule the metagame, have basically kind of gone the way of the dodo, because now all of the terrain blocks shooting lines. So it's much harder to get a shooting line, before your opponent's ready to get shot at. And that's part of the reason why those teams have not been good. But now that some of the shooting teams have access to flank and martyrs, maybe those teams are back in the menu. Maybe Deathcore are going to go out for one last spin. But really, it's probably going to be Inquisition being the most flexible of the Horde teams that's going to reap the benefits of a new tac up deck and new optimizations.
Yes. Absolutely.
Alrighty. Taz, how has Australia been going? We just talked a little bit about the WTC run where Australia did pretty good, definitely better than last year, definitely better than, last year, which is important. And you guys had a really strong run, losing only to, I think, first, second, and third. So that's always good.
Yeah,
But
Now that I'm
how's the
thinking
rest
of
of
it,
the
I think.
scene developed over time? Has this article helped?
Oh, yeah, I think so. And just touching on that quickly, I think we had a draw with the UK at WTC, and we lost to Spain and Poland. And I think it was Spain in first, UK second. We had a draw too, and then the Polish team that came third, we got absolutely smashed by. But that was game 14, and we were cooked.
Sure, that was a long weekend for everyone. For anyone who doesn't know, it was, I think, 6 games on the singles tournament, and then 8
It was
on
7 and 7 and 7.
7 and 7.
So
Yeah, it
it
was
was
a
a
long
lot.
weekend
Yeah,
for everyone.
yeah. Yeah, so locally, we had a big influx of players at the start of this edition, and now it's about a year in that we're kind of at the point where we've got a up and coming strong competitive scene in Brisbane, which is the city that I'm from, and a lot of that is thanks to the local TO who goes by Tabletop War Masters. Started running monthlies after we had a lot of interest, and we've had maybe 4 or 5 of those now. Generally getting between 16 and 20 players each time, which is fantastic. And then the kind of the longer 2-day GT style, we've only had, I think, 1 this year, and then got 1 planned coming up in March next year, the Brisbane Kill Team Open, which looking forward to that. Similarly, one of my teammates from the WCC team, Emma, runs monthlies down in Sydney, which are also popping off by the sound of it. And yeah, the Sydney scene is strong as always. And then there's people in Canberra and also some people in Melbourne. So we've got kind of 4 cities which are all doing pretty well. Personally, feels like Brisbane is growing the fastest, which is super exciting. We've got, kind of the local communities split into a handful of different team by label so that we all have this sort of healthy level of competition between us, which is really nice.
All right. Well, I hope that Battleclade is going to go well for you in the near future. I'm kind of the opinion that they're maybe a little bit too fiddly, I think, after playing with them a lot. Although they are super cool. Like, I like the models, I like painting them, but getting your opponent to agree to play the Shooter's Paradise game, I think is a little difficult sometimes.
Yeah, I definitely need some more reps with them. I've made a dark mech kit bash of them, which are currently not moist but will be, and yeah, are already gross in the way that I've made them. So I'm super excited to keep playing them. I think they're potentially in a good spot, but yes, very fiddly.
Yeah, they look great.
Alrighty, Taz, thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
And as always, thank you, listeners, for listening and tuning in.